Okay, so this is going to be a part 2 to my video about how folk musicians can be anti-fascist while being folk musicians. In the first video, I pointed out some concrete and kind of more surface level ways that we can do this. Choices that we can make that disrupt mythic past narratives, or like this notion of there was a golden era. I pointed to Jeremy's Bagpiping History podcast as an example of this. I feel like when he tells a nuanced and complicated history of piping, he's demystifying piping, which disrupts a whole bunch of like magical narratives that people have in their mind about this instrument, about this cultural practice. I talked about Matt DeBlas's practice of mixing contemporary pop songs in with his folk songs during his performances on his Celtic harp as a way of kind of disrupting fascistic narratives, because it puts the present and the past on the same equal footing, or the same kind of footing, which again interrupts people's mindset about mythic past and there used to be some great culture and now we're all degenerates or whatever. In this part 2, I want to describe another way that traditional musicians can be anti-fascist that's much less concrete, not really easy to understand, and a little woo-woo. I'm going to tell you the conclusion first, and then I'll give you my argument, just because I think that the argument will be easier to follow if you know right off the bat where it's going. But the idea is this: contemporary fascism requires this mindset where you stop thinking about the cultural history of your religious group, your national group, your ethnic group, whatever. You stop thinking of its cultural history as a real thing that actually happened, a real set of events and practices that really truly existed at one point. And you start thinking them purely as symbols. And anytime that we as folk musicians make a choice, even if it's a sneaky choice that the audience doesn't notice, but anytime we make a choice that forces the audience to see the past as a real place and not just as a symbolic idea, is anti-fascism. Let me break this down a little further. So like the first concept that we got to understand here is this idea of the fascist mindset requiring you to view the past as just a jumble of symbols and not a series of actual true events. I feel like this one's pretty self-evident, but like some specific examples might include like the way that like Christo-fascists use the Bible as a prop, but they never actually like read it or like have anything critical or interesting to say about it. They haven't internalized anything about it. You can see it when you watch MAGA insist that they are the most patriotic and like authentic version of the American identity, but also at the same time they don't know anything about American history or how American government works, and they're not even interested to learn. There's a guy who lives on my road who has a sticker on his truck that says "We the People 1776," and I laugh every time I see it, because like 1776, all right, is the year the Declaration of Independence was written, and "We the People," famously the opening line of the US Constitution, which famously was ratified in 1790. But he doesn't even care, right? Because 1776 and "We the People," they're not historical events, they're just symbols. Now, this turning of the past into just a jumble of symbols is not always bad, right? It can also be done for like funsies. The Renaissance Fair is a great example of that, right? The Renaissance Fair is not meant to be like historical reenactmentism, right? It's meant to be historical fantasy. It's about theatrics, it's about spectacle, it's not about history. So we all have this ability to do this, to create free-floating symbols out of historical realities. It's just to say that the contemporary fascism weaponizes that. Where are these disembodied suites of cultural symbols coming from? Well, they're not being created at random, right? They're modifications of real cultural symbols that existed in the past. They just met something else. In his 1981 book, Simulation and Simulacra, the French postmodernist philosopher Jean Baudrillard gives a name to this entire process. He calls this tendency of human societies to make copies of copies of copies of our cultural artifacts simulation, and he uses the word simulacra to describe the end result, these things that are like copies of ideas for which we have lost touch with the original idea. So here's a fun worked example. If I say the word princess, or princess aesthetic, or princess look, the thing that pops into your mind is probably going to be a Disney princess archetype. A sparkly waif in a gaudy pastel gown that looks like a layer cake made out of jellyfish. Baudrillard would say, isn't it weird that you don't think of an actual princess first? Like if I were to say my 6-year-old niece dressed up as a princess for Halloween, you're thinking like Elsa from Frozen. You're not thinking Catherine of Aragon or Kate Middleton. So how did that come to be the case? Well, Baudrillard would explain it something like this. He might say, back in medieval times, we had this thing called a princess. And a princess was just any woman born into a royal family in medieval Europe. But then time passed, and the royal families became less and less salient and important to people's day-to-day lives. And eventually, the main usage of the concept of a princess became symbolic only. Hans Christian Andersen and the Grimm brothers and Mother Goose stories come around, and they start playing with the idea of a princess as a symbol. Those fairy tale princesses were the simulation. Those were simulated princesses. They weren't meant to be specific named historical individuals. They weren't meant to be functioning correctly the way that medieval law dictated. They were meant to represent the idea of princess. And then eventually Walt Disney comes along, and the Disney company starts making animated movies that is playing with the ideas, playing with the symbols of those fairy tale princesses. It is making copies of the copies. In this modern world, if you could name more than 5 like actual princesses, like women born into royal European families, you'd be kind of a freak, right? Like, they're not politically important, they're not culturally important, they're kind of a footnote on a footnote on a footnote at this point. But you know who is culturally relevant, you know who is somebody that we think about all the time, is Cinderella. Simulation to the point of simulacra. Us contemporary people are dealing with these concepts, and we're using these old terms and these ancient archetypes to refer to the concept. And we think the concept is the same today as it was when it first originated, but it's not. It's a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with folk and traditional music? If you are a traditional musician, a roots musician, a folk musician, what you do is the simulation. And when you are performing for a popular audience, you are performing for a group of people who are familiar with the simulacras. And therefore, we are in a unique position to disrupt the process itself. Like I said, simulation and simulacras, they can be harmless, but they can also be harmful. The exact same set of social psychology processes that gave us the Renaissance Fair are the ones that gave us Patriot Front. Simulation and simulacra is a group psychological process that we're going through, where we're taking these elements of our own cultural history and turning them into these free-floating, disembodied set of symbols. And when you perform or study music that is coded as traditional, you are participating in the process of decontextualizing those symbols. So basically what I'm saying is, think of all of the ways that you as a musician could ruin the fun at the Renaissance Fair. You could call out historical inaccuracies. You could show up with a non-traditional instrument. You could show up with an instrument from the right time period, but not from Europe. You could choose repertoire that highlights all the ways that the past was alien or ugly or mundane. You could choose to be more traditional than the people who think that they're the most traditional. You could try to get the audience to actually imagine themselves in medieval Europe, as opposed to this like Lord of the Rings, Middle-earthy version of medieval Europe. There's a lot of different options here. There's a lot of room to be like creative and clever. All of these choices create an environment that is hostile to that process of simulation to the point of simulacra. That process that causes the past to mean nothing. The past to just be an idea, just a concept. When it's just an idea and not a reality, anybody gets to hijack it. Anybody gets to be in control of the narratives about the past. And not all of those people are going to use those narratives for good. A lot of them use it to structure power. The fascist thinks with his national identity the way the toxic fuckboy thinks with his dick. We can make that process difficult. If this whole concept sounds interesting to you, I've got a homework assignment. Go to YouTube, find the channel called Horses, and look for this video. Yes, you are living in a simulation. This is a really good video explaining the simulation and simulacra Jean Baudrillard thing. After you've watched that and you feel like you understand how the simulation and simulacra idea works, look for a channel called Michael Burns and find a video called How the Right Wing Went Postmodern. The Horses video explains what postmodernism is, what the simulation and simulacra idea are, but this video makes the connection to, and this is why Trumpism, fascism, the hard right is simulacra, is postmodernist. And then for extra reading, I'm going to recommend this video, The Surprisingly Strange History of the Renaissance Fair, on the YouTube channel of Kaz Rowe. The second half of the video, she has some really good insights about like the Renaissance Fair as performance art and not historical reenactmentism, and how that's kind of a postmodernist simulacra way of looking at the past.